Good afternoon, everyone. I'm actually talking about something I know very little about. I thought I would give that a shot because I think I don't have an answer to this question right now, but I'm hoping that some of you can actually contribute to the answer because as Sally points out, I think it's enormously important. And to follow on from Ron's theme, I love the silos within silos. I could also talk about that for ages with respect to things that not just in the federal government, but also in academia. If you don't think that's siloed, you're very much mistaken. Ask any dean. So let me just, and then what I thought I would do is I would do it in the context of some background that I have, which goes back to what was biocomplexity 20 years ago, which was the human genome. And I think there are analogies in fields that were trying to grapple with lots of data back then that we could actually learn from now as we go forward. It's not the only one, but it's the one I'm most familiar with. And so I'll try and make some analogies with that. But I think, as Sally pointed out, we're setting up a new school, and I don't know which way Richmond is, but I want to bow towards it, because if all goes well, on the 16th of September, we will be a school of data science if they approve. And so it's actually an opportunity to do something pretty big, and not just do it, as Sally pointed out, within our own institution, but really working with others. And that's really what we want to do. So with respect to what that means for responsible data science, we've sort of at least made a beginnings of a definition. It may not be the last one, but it's the practice of data science through education, research, and service, whereby all aspects of these endeavors consider the ethical, legal, and policy aspects of all we do, so that the reputation of all of us is not marred. And I actually think this is going to be the most crucial aspect of data science going forward, because we've already seen the tip of the iceberg with the likes of Cambridge Analytica and all these sort of things, how things can backfire. And I think universities are almost uniquely qualified to make contributions in this space because they have, first of all, they're completely independent. You can hire all the folks you like, you put them into a company, they develop a corporate culture. That's not necessarily independent from what needs to happen. We also have lots of different social behavioral scientists as well as STEM folks, so it's actually a sort of great environment to actually pursue the study of this. So I just want to sort of say the obvious, but in perhaps a different way, because in all the, I'm not young, and in all the time I've been in academia, I've never seen anything like what's going on right now. I mean, even bioinformatics and the human genome and all that was a little piece of this, but this is happening so broadly. And I thought I would illustrate it with a little story, which I love, which actually I think illustrates exactly what's happening. I'm sitting in my office, and the door's opened, and a fellow walks in, and he's a trauma surgeon. And he said, I've been doing trauma surgeries here in the health system at University of Virginia for a long time. And several years ago, I noticed a sort of correlation. So a lot of the people that we treat are actually car accident victims. And they come in, and their injuries, a lot of the injuries are internal. So we don't actually know what's wrong with them. So what we do is we do a full body scan. Some of them die in the scanner. And so, but what I noticed, if they recover and I talk to them, I noticed anecdotally a correlation between the type of accident they said they had and the injuries that they had. I got interested enough in this, he tells me, that I went to the Department of Motor Vehicles and got them to give me a whole bunch of accident data. Now, anyone who goes to the Department of Motor Vehicles at all deserves a medal. I'm probably really insulting some people here, sorry, but you can beat me up later. And so he got that data, he got access, obviously has access to the electronic health record, and he started doing these correlations. He taught himself a little Python and R to do it, and he's found correlations. So the whole idea is that when someone shows up at the ER, the emergency services will already send an image of a kind of accident, and that's what they'll look for internally first. If that's not, data for the public good, I don't know what is. I think it's just, but I love it as an example because it's someone who's self-taught. It aggregates data that I would have never thought was going to have some important outcome. And that's what we're doing right now. I mean, it's just, and I could go on and on about these kind of examples. They come to us every day. So, and the sort of reflection of that, the effect of it, is that the last count, there was 161, this is 2017, it's probably more like 200 initiatives now in academic institutions around this country alone, all doing something in data science to try and build this expertise. So, it's a driver. None of this is really new, and you can actually think about it in different ways. The way I like to think about it is the way Jim Gray used to think about it, who's a Turing Prize winner and someone who certainly had data in their blood. But I think the important thing here is there's been different paradigms of research. So the first one was empirical. That was almost from the beginning to the 16th century. Model-based theoretical science, thermodynamics, Newton's laws of motion, and so on. That took about 450 years, 350 years. Then we got computational science, which has been around for about 50 years. And now in the last few years, we've got this so-called fourth paradigm of data science. When I put this up in another talk, someone yelled out, "What's the fifth paradigm?" oh my God. And I don't know, but I actually thought about it in case someone asked, and I think it could potentially be unification of a lot of things that are currently considered disparately right now, which will build upon this already. So we are way in this fourth paradigm. Obviously, we all know that there's massive amounts of data growth. But if I now sort of tie that into what happened 20 years ago with the human genome, first of all, an interesting aspect of it, which is not something I'd love to talk about, we're not going to, is it was actually a public-private partnership between these two guys, Craig Venter and the NIH, and my former boss, Francis Collins. I think the bottom there, the cover of Science, sort of illustrates the kind of thing we're going to get to, which is clearly the diversity we have to deal with when we're looking at this kind of data. So that was the beginning, and I think the parallels were there, almost 20 years ago. But some stunning things have happened, as we're seeing all over the place. It's just really related to the data growth. So I would say that, lesson one here from my point of view means recognizing exponential growth that leads to unexpected consequences. And that's perhaps an obvious thing to say, but some of those consequences are not necessarily clear. Here is an example. I have a nephew staying with us right now. He's 15 years old. He could actually do gene editing in my garage. You can actually sequence a human genome on a handheld device that costs way less than $1,000. You can actually use Casper-based gene editing. You could do all sorts of stuff. I don't think the implications of that were actually thought through enough at the beginning, and I don't think they're being thought through enough now. There's 23andMe, and the notions of accuracy, and do you really want to know this stuff? These are all deep ethical questions. And then something I'm actually involved with, which is scary as all heck, the microbiome, which for those of you who are not biologically oriented, is really trying to do sequencing of your gut microbes, of which there are hundreds or millions, and trying to understand, and particularly as a diagnostic tool, what that means. I'm involved with a company called Ubiome as a scientific advisor, but just a couple of weeks ago they were raided by the FBI because of what they were doing with respect to unfair business practices, which of course I have no part in, but except my name is on that, you can pull up the web page and bing, we're there. These are scary things. We could talk more about that. All right, so one way of describing these consequences, which I like, is the so-called 6Ds, which comes from Peter Diamandis and others. And we see this across all kinds of sectors. So when something starts to get digitized, when the data arrives, there's this exponential growth, which is initially deceptive, then disruptive, and then business models and other aspects of it change completely. And that's really what's happening in a number of industries. Photography is a classic one. The current model has got nothing to do with actual photographs at all. It's about communicating through imagery, which is a completely different set of business models. So responsible data science then should try and at least anticipate or at least prepare as best we can for the consequences ahead of time. That's really hard to do, particularly when you've got this euphoric view of what you're actually doing. What we're trying to encourage every student at every moment of the day is to think about those consequences while you're working on these euphoric projects. And I'm looking at all you sitting here in the front with your grab bags, which I don't have. Lesson 3, of course, is that policies and laws lag way behind all of this. So this is just an example of something that was just signed in May. It actually relates to having native populations working with the NIH with genome sequencing with respect to effects of uranium mining on their own lands. So we've been collecting genomes for 20 years, and only now we really signed any kind of policy that relates to tribal sovereignty and things of that nature. So it's just an example of how all this lags behind, and we as data scientists have a responsibility to actually in a our own laws before they actually arrive. Then, of course, data sharing itself, this is the fourth lesson, is a double-edged sword. So here's an example that I like that relates to a disease called diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma, which is a rare form of pediatric brain cancer. You can see that over here, this is the survival rate, and it's really dismal. And there's essentially no treatment for it. Surgery is not an option because it's usually too buried in the brainstem, and chemotherapy and radiotherapy are ineffective. So, and it turns out in 2012, there was a landmark study. There was a gene identified, or a set of genes actually, that actually related to this particular disease. That was information that was known. That data was held back for 3 years. Then another group got access to the data. They actually found a different gene that the first group had not found that was related to the causation of the disease, which actually had a drug that was targeting that gene product. And so that clinical trials were underway, and potentially, and I say only potentially, but you know, it's a very rare disease, fortunately. But it's just one of many examples where 60 kids 9 years old or thereabouts die every year. If this data had been available, it could have really sped up the whole process. And but this brings the whole nature of how people think about this kind of data. There's the cultural aspects around data are huge. I mean, I think when you get to sort of some level where you can't actually do decent data science yourself anymore, everyone in the lab programs better than you do, you're stuck with dealing with these sorts of issues. And I think they're hard to deal with. So you kind of end up dealing with the cultural aspects associated with data, which are huge. They're actually bigger than the technical aspects. This data parasites was actually statements made by the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, who then essentially retracted his statements. But it sent a ripple through the community, and it would essentially say that probably everyone in this room is a form of parasite. I mean, I haven't generated any of my own data for years. We're essentially using other data. This kind of cultural aspect, and you've got to understand the other side of it, which is if you spend a lot of time collecting a longitudinal set of data, you deserve credit for that. We need new systems for this. This is a whole series of lectures on its own. Things are happening within I think what Ron was describing within the Census Bureau in terms of platforms and so forth. That's something that is sort of happening in the NIH now, and I think workforce development, all these other things. And I won't go into them, but there is, I think there's a lot of efforts within agencies and across agencies, has already been said, and I don't need to elaborate on that. But it is a double-edged sword. So here's an example of a study that is just a newborn screening. In Virginia, at least, and it varies by state, every newborn gets a blood spot. And that blood spot is analyzed, and this is all the data that's actually available from it. And in fact, the final data set here contained about 1.6 million samples from 29,000 diagnostic records. Now, the reason this is done, and there's genetic markers that look for, particularly for sickle cell anemia. So this is the distribution of sickle cell anemia based on that blood spotting in Virginia. The issue with it is that sickle cell anemia particularly affects African Americans. And it actually describes very much the distribution of African Americans within the population of Virginia. Now, so these are just, I wouldn't say this was necessarily an unforeseen consequence in this case, but it just shows that how different data can be interpreted and used in different ways. So all things to be looked out for. So these are some lessons from just one vertical, in this case, some things that related to genomics. So what should we be doing as a School of Data Science? This is what we're asking ourselves now as we establish ourselves when we're doing data science for the public good. Well, we have some guiding principles, and I would really, formally or whatever, really interested in having your input. I think first and foremost, we have to be completely open and transparent and collaborative in what we do as individuals within this collective. And we're essentially developing a whole strategy around these principles. So we're hiring people who are going to conform to those principles, which, trust me, is not the standard academic model for how people operate. So, for example, everyone needs to have a persistent identifier so we can actually locate them in cyberspace, which we can't do right now. Disambiguation is a big problem. We don't assign, because what we want to do is we want to assign value to non-traditional academic things. Like, guess what? Data. You don't get any rewards for actually producing really high-quality data. You get rewards for producing papers. This is crazy. This is just crazy. Right? Example of my own experience. I have a paper that's got oodles and oodles, thousands and thousands of citations. No one has ever read that paper. It's a paper about a data set that everybody uses, and they don't cite the data set. You have to write a paper that refers to the data set so there's something to cite. That's all changed slowly. It's changing. Data citation, analytics citation, these are things on the horizon. And just imagine now what you can do. You can go from a paper to a data set. And from that data set, you can see all other papers that have used that data set. And you can see what they've done with it. Got all sorts of crazy ideas about Yelp for data and all sorts of things. We don't have time for that. Preprints. This was something we got the NIH to actually approve while I was there, which is the idea. A preprint is a peer-reviewed version of the paper that's available to everybody. And trust me, you get these reviews these days when everyone's motivated to write but not to read. You get some pretty crappy reviews. You put this in the public domain, the people who really care about the work that you're doing, they're the ones who'll review it for you. I'm not saying we need to do away with peer review. Well, I personally am, but that's another story. But there are other models out there. We're encouraging all this within the school. That's the point. Recognizing all of this in our hiring and promotion. Also working with entities like the Wikimedia Foundation. There is data going into Wikidata now faster than almost any other entity. And they're linking it to Wikipedia, to the knowledge associated with Wikipedia and the citation, there's WikiCite and these other things. It's starting, and you can run Sparkle queries on all this stuff. So it's starting to create this infrastructure that's pretty powerful. We actually have someone in our organization who's responsible for helping make this, popularize this and contribute to it. And then we need much better data governance within institutions. I've yet to work in any institution that has good data governance. Certainly the one I'm in right now, it's not that good at all. So we really need to do that. We could talk more about this stuff. So just quickly, when we consider the guiding principles across the complete data workflow, which is really about how we acquire data, how we engineer data, how we analyze it, how we essentially make it accessible and disseminate it. So just quickly, there's some of the ethical issues around here, and they're huge. So just in data acquisition, for example, the notion of what that means with respect to data surveillance, privacy terms of services, and data sovereignty are clearly very key issues. I've actually sat in a room, and I think we need to fully appreciate the breadth of the population that we're dealing with. So the All of Us is an initiative to sequence elements of 1 million people and also have a very broad health record, including biosamples on 1 million people. They already have data on about 250,000. There's huge efforts to try and make that a diverse population. I think that's going to be a real struggle to actually do that. I say that because I've sat in a room with reasonable people who think that the flu vaccine is a government conspiracy. And seriously, I mean, so, you've got, and yet those are also people you want to capture within this framework. So it's difficult. Data engineering, I think, when you bring things together, the consequences of integration, we talked about the trauma surgeon. Well, that's a good example, but there are also lots of bad examples. And the IP issues around all of this. And then algorithm bias and accountability and transparency when you're looking at analysis. lots of different, you're aware of a whole series of issues. I don't think this is something we need as we're teaching our students, and this is something, it's not just giving a course on ethics, it's actually instilling this kind of issue every single day. And new things crop up all the time. And it's not just around algorithmic bias, it's just bias even in sampling. There was a whole hoo-ha at the NIH a year or two ago, which is still not really being resolved, that virtually all experiments, animal model experiments done on mice, are done on male mice. That's a big problem. Not just if you're a male mouse. That was terrible, sorry. All right. I mean, I think visualization, and the storytelling aspect is really important in how we convey, all of you convey the messages about what you're doing. But, there's issues, when you do that, you have to be careful of confidentiality, you have to be careful of distorting facts and so on. All these things to think about when you're actually making a nice glossy thing to send out. These are the kind of things you need to think about. And then, finally, the dissemination, there's issues of security, dual use, and all this kind of thing. And something that, just to point it out in dissemination, one of the things that we instilled at the NIH when I was there was the notion of being fair. And fair means the ability to find, access, interoperate, and reuse data. And that's easily said and, not that easily done. But that's what they're now working towards, building the frameworks and the platforms they're doing, the so-called common data commons, to actually achieve these kinds of things in a similar way to the Census Bureau. So what's the take-home for all of this? For me, at least, the fourth paradigm is upon us. We now know what the fifth paradigm is. We're forming a new school, which is an opportunity to do it right, or at least do it better, than, say, what happened in other fields earlier on. But we need help. This is not something you can do alone. Looking to these other fields, you can certainly get best and, frankly, worst practices. And I think, it involves developing a set of guiding principles. And considering what you do across the complete life cycle, not just at the end of the study. So to me, at least, that's the beginning of how we're thinking about undertaking data science for the public good. So thank you very much.